LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of violent crime. Please listen with care. Welcome to Crime Insiders Forensics. For those joining us for the first time, my name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world. Imagine a crime scene where the forensic investigators are completely in the dark, deep underwater, and in alligator-infested areas. Today's guest, Sarah Mormino, doesn't have to imagine. It's her job as one of a handful of qualified forensic divers in Florida.
We did have someone who was consistently on shore and on the boat with a firearm, just in case.
Lack of research and funding has meant that police divers focus on retrieval of bodies, often missing vital forensic evidence and clues in the water.
The child did drown. Can we confirm this is an accidental drowning? Then let's not make sure that we're not looking at a homicidal drowning.
To begin, Sarah tells us about one of her first cases on the job as a civilian forensic investigator, where she identified a huge opportunity that police divers could not only be experts in retrieval, but also in the collection and preservation of crucial forensic evidence.
I am employed with a sheriff's office. However, I do not go through the police academy. I am what they call a civilian. So I don't carry a gun, but I got hired on with them actually originally in child protection. And then once an opening came up in forensics, I transferred over and then trained with them for a forensic investigator position. So with my position, we are a field response team, not in the lab. So we respond out to any kind of crime scene that they deem necessary, anything from a burglary to a homicide, and actually process the scene and collect the physical evidence.
What was the first case that actually made you think about combining forensic science and diving?
Yeah, it was very quick within my forensic career. I think I was only about a month in training. Our agency received a call for a decedent who was found floating in a retention pond. Immediately when the call came out, I was interested, especially if a month in, you're just like, oh my gosh, I want to see everything. And it was funny when they handed out the call, when I was looking at the call on the dispatch screen, it's all just listed as accidental drowning, believed to be like narcotics involved. So everyone kind of responded with this mindset of it's a heavy homeless area. The person was probably under the influence, fell in the water and drowned. This is an accident. Even before people arrived at the scene, that's what I was observing, that it was just automatically this mindset. Once get out to the scene, the dive team was called, just for really the simple fact of, even though he was floating, he was pretty far out on the water, so you couldn't just pull him in. But even so, the dive team went out, just kind of grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and pulled him to shore. I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem like quite a recovery, but okay. But once again, everyone's under this mindset that it's just, let's document this scene and it's an accident, close it out. Pulled him up on shore. When he was flipped over, it turned out he had over 30 stab wounds throughout his body. So now it's the immediate, oh crap, this is a homicide. Now what? And that case immediately got me thinking. I started asking the people in the sheriff's office, because I was relatively new still, are there forensic members on the dive team? Do forensics partner with the dive team at all? It just seemed like there was so much more that could be done that wasn't done. And I was told, hey, it's considered a certified position. You have to have gone through the law enforcement academy, carry a gun, which I think is a little crazy. And that's how it is in most of the United States. Most law enforcement dive teams consisted of our deputies, our police, our detectives. A lot of times forensics is not involved at all. There's maybe a handful of forensics on dive teams across the United States. And I said that was stupid. So I petitioned to try out for the team. and basically explained the benefit of having a forensic investigator on the team, considering whether it's a body recovery, evidence recovery, a car recovery. They all have some forensic aspect to it. Then shortly thereafter, I tried out and I made the team and have kind of really invested a lot of my personal and professional time researching the aspects of how water impacts forensic investigations so that we can ensure that we are conducting those thorough investigations from the very, very beginning.
In retrospect, with the case of the non-accidental drowning with all the stab wounds, what would you have done differently on that scene?
Yeah, so one thing I always train when I'm educating other dive team members is, first of all, we should always be doing a preliminary investigation from within the water, a swim around a lot of the time. So when we dive, we are close to no visibility water. A lot of the times you can only see maybe a couple inches in front of your face, and sometimes that's a stretch. But I feel like that excuse is almost utilized too often because we do have some visibility at times. So we should be, even if they're floating, doing a complete swim around under the decedent, besides the decedent, to actually have a body examination, examine the body before it's even removed. At that point, then, if we can start to see some indications of trauma, we can preserve the hands, we can preserve any other areas that we're concerned about, trace DNA. If a lot of times we focus on hair and anywhere on the face, a lot of times we can get some good forensic value there. So we can preserve it and then actually document it starting in the water, mark the location, mark the water temperature, the depth, the bottom conditions, then actually bag the decedent after we've kind of protected the trace evidence the best we can, and then bring the decedent to shore. So really, in retrospect, at that scene, not having forensics on the team, did it alter the investigation completely? Did it ruin the investigation? Absolutely not. But were there things that could have been done better that could have helped preserve that forensic DNA and the presence? Because there was absolutely some kind of a struggle. But if we're just dragging a body through the water, you're washing away all that trace DNA that could be under fingernails, on the body, in the wounds, really anything that's attached to the body. If there's any fibers, they're just washing away. So it's all about that documentation and preservation on the front end.
How do you actually preserve the hands then, for example, and hair? What do you actually do?
So honestly, the best way is just like the nylon stockings that women wear on their feet, on their legs, because you could actually just take those nylon stockings out of package and slip them onto the hands. What's nice about those is they do have holes so that it can allow the water to wash through while it's trapping any fibers or DNA kind of in their place. Some agencies use like plastic bags. Those just unfortunately trap water and they create more of a hassle. You're more likely to lose items than evidence when you're trying to remove the plastic bag. So just nylon stockings over the hands, right from before the decedent's moved at all. And then you can actually remove the nylon stocking, send the nylon stocking off to the lab, and you could also process the hands because that should have kept any fibers or hairs under the nails in place.
Has there been any concern about DNA from the factories that make the stockings?
I mean, unfortunately, you have that everywhere. We have to kind of pick and choose our battles. So yes, we want to try, of course, we're going to use brand new stockings. And this is another problem, is that anything aquatic forensic related is so under-researched, so undervalued, that a lot of these issues haven't even been addressed. So solutions haven't been found. So we have to make our own solutions. And the best way to make our own solutions is use what we have. And for right now, that is the best option, the most successful option.
Do you know what happened with the case of the first person that you mentioned, the one who had all the stab wounds and was presumed to be an accidental drowning?
Yes, so that case actually was cold for a couple of years, and they had a person of interest the detectives did a great job really following up on the back end of that case. But it really was a team effort, because even on that case too, he was a John Doe. We could not identify him. So this is a perfect example of what a lot of times people see in like the textbooks. But what we actually had to do in that case is our latent examiners came in. We completely degloved the hand because he was decomposed, and they actually put a glove on and then slipped their hand into his degloved hand to roll his prints to identify him. So once we were able to identify him that way, the detectives got the ball rolling. They had a person of interest, but they didn't have enough. The case was cold for a couple of years. Then they finally did make an arrest of that person, and he actually, it was due to go to court January of this year, and the suspect pled out like last minute. So the case is now closed. They did make an arrest and a conviction, but it took almost, I think, 4 years for that arrest to be made.
How big is the forensic diving community?
Super small. In Florida, I think I only know, so Florida's where I'm located in the United States. It's a pretty big state, and it's a peninsula. We are surrounded by water. I think there might only be 3 civilian forensic divers in the whole state. And that's probably most, I would say that most compared to other states in the United States. Even I was in Australia last year. While I was there, I had the honor of actually working with the Australian Federal Police, who are well aware that they are all officers, and they recognize the fact that they aren't trained in forensics. They don't have forensic knowledge. And so they are, hey, what can we do to be better? And there was 2 forensic scientists who work in the lab who are dive certified who were interested in partnering with their dive team. So we were able to get them together for a couple days and train together on, hey, this is what forensics needs. This is what forensics is looking for. Teaching the dive team the capabilities of forensics, and teaching forensics the capabilities of the dive team. Because I get that there's a lot of liability. There's a lot of rules when it comes to who can be on a dive team. So it might not be possible to have a civilian forensics on the dive team, but that doesn't mean you can't have the collaboration.
Who's dictating? Is it the divers who are more likely to recommend what needs to be done, or is it the entomologists, or is it some great collaboration?
It's the collaboration all the way. And that's why it is so important for that understanding. Because even in my agency, I'm part of the dive team, but my team members in forensics, they are not there with us when we're diving. They are not there with us when we're practicing. They are not in the water. So they don't know how we do our search patterns. They don't know the type of water conditions we're diving in, what equipment we use. So in some cases, forensics might say, hey, I need you to do X, Y, Z. But the dive team might have to come back and be like, well, given the circumstances we're diving in, that is not possible. So there needs to be that understanding. We're doing it all by feel. We cannot see, like I said, most of the time we cannot see anything. So all of our searches are strictly by feel. Our hands are our most beneficial tool. So when you come across something, you're sitting there just rubbing it, being like, okay, is this the item that I'm looking for? And of course, as you're just rubbing it with our big dive gloves, you're just destroying any fingerprints, any DNA. So we want to limit the handling of the item in the water, but it's also unrealistic to say, hey, if you find something, just touch it with a finger, confirm that it's that, and then leave it be, because that's not the realistic answer either. It's all about that collaboration and finding that happy medium. And the same thing can be said with entomologists, anthropologists. They're all looking for different things. They need preservation of different items and done in different ways. And the dive teams need to be aware of that, but they also need to be aware that dive teams cannot control our scenes as well as we can on land.
What are your retrieval rates like? Do you have any idea?
I don't, and that's because, quite honestly, we've had a few cases where we know, hey, we are looking for something in here and it's in here, and we have found it, so that's great. But It's frustrating because a lot of the times when we get called, it is either one, it's just we are missing a weapon, or we think something's in here and we just need you to check it. So we have no idea if it's actually in there. It just might be a body of water that's close to the crime scene. So, hey, let's check it just to make sure it's not in there. So we can't confirm or deny if it was in there in the first place, but we'll still ensure that we're doing a very thorough search. We've also had times where we have had suspects say, hey, I threw it in this body of water. We had one, it was about 2 years ago now, where they admitted to throwing a gun in a pond. And we were out there for a couple hours and we're like, we have thoroughly searched this pond and we are like 99.9% sure there is nothing in here. And the detectives are like, well, the suspect said that it's in there. And we're like, there is nothing in here. We left, come to find out the suspect lied the whole time. And it was actually in the shed in the backyard. That's where the weapon was. Most of the time, like I said, if we know something's in there, we find it. We had a case then a few months ago where we were looking and the suspect had stated that they threw a firearm in a body of water. And the body of water was an overflow of the Gulf, but also kind of a mix of sewer, also just like mangroves. It was a mix of a whole bunch of things. And it was, the water itself was only maybe 3 feet, a meter deep. So not very deep. So we didn't actually dive it. We kind of waded it, but it had this varying silt layer that created a challenge. So we didn't find the gun, but then but we knew our search was poor given just the circumstances of the body of water. So we took the further steps, and because it was so small, we actually just drained it, and then we're actually digging through the sediment, and then we found it. So sometimes you have to get creative as well.
Just aside, we had the Snowtown murders in South Australia here, and they were barrels with acid, and the bodies were in barrels. And the pathologist there, poor thing, it was his first night on call, and he had to work out how to drain the acid to not lose vital evidence as well. So he had to basically make shift and think logically and try to preserve as much evidence as possible without routine equipment. So I imagine there's something that people would have to face from water retrievals as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, I do teach this aspect, like the forensic application of underwater recovery on the side as well. And I used to call it that, specifically forensic application to underwater recovery. And then I realized it's kind of a poor name because it's not just underwater recovery. It's any kind of aquatic or liquid environment. We have a deficit in research and resources in all of it, whether it's acid, even if we're talking about bathtub deaths or just processing evidence that's been in the rain. It's all just so under-researched and just not really properly trained for. It's crazy. Like I said, I'm in Florida, the state surrounded by water. When I joined forensics, really the only training I got in any kind of water-related incident was to collect the temperature and then just collect a water sample. That was really all the training I had. That's barely scratching the surface of what should be done, even from shore. We should be taking measurements. We should be doing reenactments. We should be preserving that evidence and teaching how we have the chemicals. There's chemicals out there that can process wet evidence. A lot of agencies don't even have those chemicals available to them. So the processing isn't even being done. It's being assumed the water destroyed all evidence. So I'm just going to put the item in a bag or dry it, or even just submit it in the water if it's metal and call it a day. And we're missing valuable evidence because no one's trained in how to handle and process it.
Do you see that changing?
I mean, drowning is the third cause of unnatural death in the world. And I feel like we get, as there are responding officers, our dive teams, we kind of get complacent and say, oh, well, it's probably just an accident. Like, for example, just say, like, making the assumption, oh, well, he was fishing and he just fell in. So that's what it is, case closed. Or in the case that got me started, oh, he is in a homeless area in a high narcotic area. So, oh, he just must have been under the influence of drugs and fell in the water. we cannot just assume. I always joke that I'm not here to make every case a homicide or a murder, but I am here to say that we should be conducting a thorough investigation until we can prove or disprove the original theory that it's an accident. Now, in the case of the stabbing I was talking about, that was clear. Okay, he was stabbed and then he was placed in the water. But even if we're dealing with homicidal drownings or cases where people are killed in the water, a lot of times it's hard for even our medical examiners, our pathologists, to determine if it's an accidental or a homicidal drowning, especially when we're dealing with children, because children don't have the ability to fight back. So there's not going to be, if they're dealing with a heavy mass or weight difference. So there's not going to be defensive wounds. You probably won't see bruising. And to the medical examiner, they're just going to be able to say, hey, the child did drown, but it's up to the dive team, it's up to forensics, it's up to the detectives to examine the scene circumstances and the forensic evidence on scene to say, okay, can we confirm this is an accidental drowning? What are the circumstances? And let's not make sure that we're not looking at a homicidal drowning. You know, a study that I hope to do in the future, I haven't figured out the ins and outs of how I want to do it yet, but I do want to kind of go through all of the accidental drowning case folders and see how many of them were closed accidental when they did have suspicious circumstances to them that were kind of just disregarded. But yeah, I do want to be clear that I'm not trying to bash recovery divers by any means or police divers, because they are all very well trained in public safety diving, in the recovery methods, in how to conduct thorough searches. And it's just simply because of the fact that a lot of them are sworn, and coming from the road and coming from that detective and officer side, they just have different priorities. They have different responsibilities because they've never had to be trained in forensics, because they have forensic investigators for that. And forensic investigators are not trained in the officer's roles and responsibilities. So that's why it comes down to that partnership, because both of them have very great strengths and assets that they can bring. But it's the partnership between the two that, just like on land, creates that thorough investigation.
But as with any specialty, the forensic component is very different from anthropology. Forensic anthropology is quite different from anthropology. It's not a criticism, it's just an acceptance of fact.
Yeah, and we do have an anthropologist that's hired with my department, and he actually went through some diving training with me. So if we ever did have a case with skeletal remains, he could actually assist on his end. Because anthropology, while I am familiar with a good portion of anthropology from my degree, I'm not nearly as specialized in the training as he is. So you're right, you have to rely on those resources when needed. Like, I'm always fascinated when our anthropologist speaks. He's super smart, and it's just, I learned something from him every time. But I've consulted with him on several things that I'm unfamiliar with. There was one case where we were looking for teeth, actually. It was a dismemberment case, and they were missing all of the teeth. And there was a body of water behind the house. So even with that, I had to think, I'm like, would teeth float or would they sink? So even that, I messaged him, and I'm just like, because I wasn't sure. But teeth will sink, in case you were wondering. So even just that collaboration, just bumping the questions off of each other, could help.
In terms of Florida, this is very stereotypical, but one of the first things we tend to think of is alligators and the southern bayou type thing, and seeing them on golf courses and waterways and things. Is that a realistic threat to you?
Absolutely. So it's funny you asked that. I actually had we had a dive mission today. We were working a cold case, and our Marine unit was out there, and they were surveying the water first. And they're like, hey guys, just a heads up, there's a gator out there about 10 feet. So about 2.5 meters for you guys, like, or 3 meters, a little more than 3 meters. And I was like, so I am aware almost every body of water in Florida, fresh body of water, has an alligator in it. I don't need to know that though, but it is a threat. And that's because they are predatory animals. They're kind of like sharks in the way that sharks always get the bad rap, that sharks are just going to, if you're on the water with a shark, they're going to eat you, even though there's only like 3 deaths a year from sharks. Alligators are the same way. Most of the time, if you leave them alone, they're going to leave you alone. But it is something that we need to be concerned about. So especially today, knowing that we had that large alligator in the body of water we were searching, we did have someone who was consistently on shore and on the boat with a firearm, just in case, God forbid, something happened. But what is nice from a forensic aspect is that because they are predatory, a lot of people think that they're also going to like destroy if a body is in water with an alligator, that the alligator is just going to destroy the body. Most of the time, alligators, crocodiles, they are not scavengers, they're predators. So once a decedent's in the water, unless it's super fresh, they can sense that they are already dead and they have no interest. So a lot of the times we don't have to worry about them destroying our evidence that way. When we're dealing with our evidence and our bodies, we obviously want to make sure that we're preserving as much of the body as we can. And that's also why it's all aware of it's good to know the timeline, because if we are dealing with a body of water that has crabs, turtles, lobsters, like anything in the crustacean, and then turtles are just, they're vicious, but they can skeletize a human in less than 2 days. So it's good to be aware of, if we are told that, hey, there might be a body in this area of water, and we know that there's turtles in there, we know that there are crabs in there, it is like a race against the clock to try to find that body, because they can do some damage. A lot of people think fish activity is the most common, but a lot of times big fish don't really have an interest, and small fish will just kind of sit there and nibble on the bodies. So you just might see just like these little spots of discoloration on the body, but they don't really do a lot of damage. But turtles and crabs, they will just chomp like chunks off of a body, and they kind of bring it away and eat it and go back and just take another chunk out of the body. We had one case here probably a couple of years ago now, but we recovered and the whole, basically half the face was missing, and it was most likely from turtles. But that's also why a lot of the time our dive teams are so important, not even just for the recovery aspect, but because we need to have that understanding of the water that we are diving in. Because say a body was found floating in water and they could reach it and just pull it to shore, but then you have half of his face missing. Well, where did that come from? So you need to have divers to go in there to do an assessment of the water. What kind of wildlife is in there? What are our bottom conditions like? If we pull someone up and they have scratches all on their hands and their face, are those defensive wounds, or are those travel abrasions from being dragged along the bottom and the bottom's covered with rocks? Okay, so maybe we can say those are travel abrasions. But if we're pulling someone up and they've got scratches and the divers come up and say, we've got a completely sandy, smooth bottom, there is nothing down there that would scratch them, then okay, now we can say these might be defensive wounds, and now we need to look at this case a little differently. So the diver's job is really so important, even outside the recovery aspect. Just serving the area, having an understanding of water and how it impacts the body, and then really relaying that information to the medical examiner so that they can make an accurate conclusion about injuries and where they came from, when, how, and so forth.
That's something I'd never thought of, and that's actually vital. The environment at the bottom of the water.
Yes. And temperature, like we should always be getting temperature. Forensics is a lot of times trained to get temperature, but they only have the tools to probably get the surface temperature. But if you're dealing with very deep water, that water temperature is going to change. Cold water significantly changes how a body acts then compared to hot water. So it'll change decomposition rates. It will change the presence of forensic evidence. So there's really so much more that the dive, and that's why it's just so important to have that communication. Even if forensics isn't on the team, forensics on shore can say, hey, based on what I'm seeing on the scene, it would really help me out if you guys could go in the water and tell me what the bottom conditions are like, what the temperature is, and what animal activity is present, and just kind of give me a quick survey. And most of the time, divers, they love to be in the water. So that's an extra 5 minutes of work for them. but it can make the world of difference in a case.
I'm a non-diver. So can you please explain why visibility is so poor in so many cases?
Yes, and that's quite frankly probably the fear that keeps most people away from joining their dive teams, because there's a lot of people that do dive and I'll be like, hey, join the dive team. And they're like, I don't want to dive in those conditions. And that's because we are diving in the waters that no one is voluntarily going to go in. Because when you think about it, whether it's an accidental drowning, if we're dealing with a body dump, homicidal drowning, or an evidence search, a lot of the times it is going to be those small ponds, rivers, reservoirs, retention ponds, lakes, sometimes sewers. Because really, even when you talk about underwater recovery, we might not always be diving. Sometimes we are wading through sewers. We are wading through the overflow water channels on the side of the road, because no one else is going to do it. So that's what anything water related, that's what we are. And a lot of these bodies of water are not all, but a lot of them are still, and they're high bacteria environments. So what that ultimately creates is this heavy silt sediment layer on the bottom. Sometimes it can be just a few centimeters deep, a few inches deep. Other times it can be several feet, several meters deep. And the second you hit that sediment layer, it is just like a big cloud of dirt surrounds you. But we have no option but to hit that sediment layer, because if we're looking for, once again, if we go back to saying we're looking for a gun in the water, that gun is going to sink to the bottom. So that's where we're searching. So a lot of the times our nickname are bottom feeders, because we're just told to go in the water, sink to the bottom, and conduct our search on the bottom. And like I said, because of the high bacteria, lots of algae, lots of debris, it is just black water. Every once in a while, we'll get an evidence search or a body search and recovery in the ocean. And those are like the best case scenarios for us, because in the ocean, we can at least have a few feet of visibility, and then it makes it so much better. But that's not the case in most scenarios.
So in terms of other equipment that you take, that's very different from other crime scenes, or it may be the same as, what equipment are you actually using?
So most of the time, like I said, it is our hands. That's going to be that's our main equipment. When we dive, we're always tethered, and that's for safety reasons, but it also helps us conduct our search. So just like we would conduct line searches, spiral searches on land, we have the same kind of search patterns in water. They're done a little differently. Once you're in the water, you can't just say, well, I'm going to dive a straight line and then move over a couple feet and dive a straight line. Because once you're in water, you get so distorted, there's no way to confirm that you're doing a straight line. And if you're sitting there looking at your compass the whole time to ensure that you are going in a straight line, then you're not actually searching. From the underwater forensic standpoint, I'm also a certified underwater photographer. So I do have a underwater camera that I utilize when I can. Once again, because of the low visibility, it is not always possible, but we always at least try to, when we do find a piece of evidence, when we do have a body recovery, to photograph it. One, that helps us do our preliminary investigation of the scene and kind of assessment with what we're dealing with. And then two, we can actually document the condition of the body, the piece of evidence as it is, and really, like I said, go back to that thorough investigation, documenting from the very beginning.
What is the weirdest or most shocking thing that you've actually found under the water?
Yeah, so we come across some crazy things. I mean, we've come across golf carts, washing machines, bikes, tires. It's crazy what people will dump in water. I would say we've even come across cases where we're looking for a firearm, and we've found firearms that aren't even the firearms we're looking for. I've found like toilet paper wrappers. Like, why is this stuff in the water? There's no need for any of it. So I don't know if I can name a specific weird item, but yeah, it's just, sometimes it just makes you think, like, what was the reason for even just putting this in the water? What's the reason?
Sarah, look, this has been incredible. And forensic diving is just such a wide area that I think, as you said, is under-researched, but can provide such vital information for cases and for families as well. And can teach so many branches of the police and forensics things as well and learn from. So thank you for everything you're doing. I think it's brilliant, and good luck with your research and your doctorate, and keep diving.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here, and I'm just excited to talk about it.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox, and is produced by Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.